Jacques Lacan. By way of introduction, Lacan is a French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. He is indebted to the works of Freud and Saussure, which we will attempt to explore. According to the book flap of his most famous work, Écrit, Jacques Lacan was one of the most influential French thinkers of the 20th century, part of an extraordinary constellation of minds that included Lévi-Strauss, Althusser, Barthes, and Foucault. For 20 years, his weekly seminar, attended by a whole generation of French intellectuals, was a principal source of his influence and reputation. That's a pretty impressive all-star lineup of minds to be in the company of. First thing we're going to do is backtrack to Freud for a moment before we propel into Lacan's world. Neuroses, or neurotic tendencies, are the symptoms that come up to the surface when we repress our desires. Perhaps those desires don't fall in line with the social order, and we learn that to fit in with society, we must hold back or repress them. Our desires, pure and unadulterated, are all id. Our superego, or moral codes, teach us to control them so that we fit in. Before breaking it down completely, I want you to understand any kind of desire is always meant to fill a lack. So what exactly are we lacking? Lacan gives a framework to understand where those unconscious desires come from and how they are ultimately trying to fill that lack. The first thing we'll talk about is the imaginary order. One of the most important aspects of Lacanian psychoanalysis is his work concerning individual identity formation. He starts at the beginning with analyzing the psychological development of the infant. According to Lacan, when a child is first born, they are unable to distinguish themselves from their environment. Physically, they see no difference between a rattle and their fist. Both are fair game to insert into the mouth for further exploration. Additionally, they do not yet understand they are separate from their mother. There is a deep sense of unity felt between mother and child. It is not until a baby reaches what Lacan calls the mirror stage that they begin to see themselves differently and are said to pass through this phase or stage around 6 to 8 months. The mirror stage initiates something Lacan calls the imaginary order, which refers to the world of images and perception. When a baby sees himself in the mirror, or even if he sees himself mirrored back to himself by a mother or father, he begins to develop a sense of self, or ego, for the first time. This ego that one develops is ideal and has been referred to as the ideal I, or might be better understood as one's ideal self. Lois Tyson points out in Critical Theory Today that this imaginary order, or world of images, is one that maintains a sense of fullness, completeness, or delight, because there is such a strong mutual desire between mother and baby. This desire for the mother is a kind of foundation on which identity is formed. It is not until the child acquires language that this bond begins to dissipate. Keep in mind that this world is illusory. The child imagines their image is his self because it is the way the baby perceives reality. Lacan's translator, Alan Sheridan, notes, quote, "The imaginary order was when the world, the register, the dimension of images, conscious or unconscious, perceived or imagined." Whatever sense of self is developed in this stage is what a person will likely pursue thereafter. The symbolic order. According to Lacan, when a baby begins to acquire language, they move from the imaginary order to the symbolic order. The way this relates to identity formation has to do with where we left off with semiotics. In the process of meaning making, we first acknowledge the sign. Remember, signifier plus signified. And then we acknowledge the relationship between different signs. Following that logic, a baby begins to believe their image is their self when they pass through the mirror stage. Once they acquire language, differentiation takes place as they begin to understand that self, or what they come to know as I, is not another, or said another way, is not you. Along these lines, Murakami acknowledges pronouns are in effect a means of defining the individual. When a child acknowledges this, they also begin to feel a loss of unity with their mother. In other words, they begin to recognize for the first time that he or she is separate from their mother. Mother and baby are two separate beings, and for the infant, they will forever feel a sense of loss, or what Lacan calls lack. In the immediate context of a baby's life, it triggers what is called separation anxiety. Following that, though, is a desire to fill the void caused by this separation with anything that will feign that sense of mutual desire and need for one's mother. According to Tyson, quote, "We will spend our lives unconsciously pursuing it, the desire for mother, in the symbolic order. Maybe I'll recapture that feeling of union if I find the perfect mate, if I acquire more money, if I convert to a different religion, if I become better looking, if I become more popular, or if I buy a flashier car, a bigger house, or whatever the symbolic order tells me I should want." Ultimately, this will never work because a person never realizes what they are striving after is a stand-in for that perfect union with mother. And more than that, there is no going back. What we pursue to fill this lack is what Lacan calls objet petit a, or object small a. The A is short for autre, or other in French. This becomes our object of desire that we pursue to replace that sense of loss. Where this connects to Freud is that the desire for this object is felt unconsciously, or in other words, is repressed. Lacan inherits a great deal of his understanding of the unconscious from Freud. Once a person enters into the symbolic order and represses that initial desire for the union with one's mother, there is a notable distinction between the conscious and unconscious mind. Sometimes there are physical objects that connect us to that repressed desire, which is where this becomes interesting for literary purposes. Tyson notes, quote, "Although the lost object of desire is literally our pre-verbal fantasy union with our mother, there can be events or even whole periods of time later in our youth that we unconsciously associate with that fantasy union, that are stand-ins for it, and that we therefore respond to as lost objects of desire." A prime example of this might be the librarian in Hard-Boiled Wonderland's insatiable appetite. That might be considered her objet petit a. Her pursuing the food incessantly is an example of what she desires unconsciously to fill that void. Another possibility is the unicorn school for the Calcutech and the dream reader. Remember, the way the book describes the unicorn, quote, "In the East, peace and tranquility. In the West, aggression and lust. Nonetheless, the unicorn remains an imaginary animal, an invention that can embody any value one wishes to project." This is exactly how a person's objet petit a works. It embodies the wishes one wants to project in hopes to return to the pre-verbal time and space where an infant feels a strong sense of unity, particularly with one's mother. This loss or lack of unity is crucial and connects us directly to what we learned about language. Language, or words, function as a substitute for the thing in itself. We use words as substitutes for things because we are separate from those things, and we need language to represent our concepts of those things. As Terry Eagleton notes, quote, "All desire springs from a lack, which it strives to continually fill. Human language works by such a lack, the absence of the real objects which signs designate, the fact that words have meaning only by virtue of the absence and exclusion of others." Next, we're going to talk about what Lacan calls the real. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, Lacan describes something he calls the real. This is different from the imaginary order and the symbolic order in that there is no way to linguistically express the real. Tyson describes the real as the feeling we have that this is not all there is. Lacan describes it as traumatic because it brings one to the realization that reality is made up of socially constructed rules. The Wachowski brothers try to capture this moment of recognition when Neo learns about the Matrix. Tyson writes, "The trauma of the real gives us only the realization that the reality hidden beneath the ideologies society has created is a reality beyond our capacity to know and explain, and therefore certainly beyond our capacity to control." As she points out, it is beyond explanation because the real is not confined by language. We will continue to discuss the real, but keep in mind that even though I have a picture of it here, that is a kind of linguistic expression. There is no way to symbolically represent the real. There is no way to articulate it. There is no way to talk about it. The real is completely inaccessible from our socially constructed, linguistically mediated world.